The world's best-selling biscuit is not Oreo. It is not made by Nestlé. It is not made by some 100-year-old European company with a marble headquarters and 1,000 food scientists on the payroll. The world's best-selling biscuit by volume is made in India. It costs 5 rupees. And it was built by a family that had never made a biscuit in their lives, in a rented house in a Mumbai suburb, at a time when India was still a British colony, and the very idea of an Indian competing with British brands was considered laughable. You would think a small-town boy with no food industry background, no foreign training, no factory, and no capital could never take on the might of the British biscuit empire and win. Right? Well, Mohanlal Dayal would build Parle products in 1929 and create a biscuit so cheap, so perfectly made for the Indian palate, and so deeply woven into the daily lives of 1 billion people that it would eventually outsell every other biscuit on the planet. Not just in India. On Earth. He would do it during a world war, during partition, during price wars with multinational giants, during liberalization that threw open Indian markets to every foreign brand with deep pockets and aggressive marketing. And he would do it by making one simple, unshakable decision that his competitors never understood. He was not selling a biscuit. He was feeding a nation. So how did a small-town boy from a family of sweets makers beat the British at their own game, on Indian soil, and build the most consumed biscuit brand in human history? To find out, we have to go back to 1900. Vile Parle. Today, it is a busy suburb of Mumbai, crowded with apartment buildings, traffic, and the constant hum of a city that never stops. But in the early 1900s, it was a quiet, almost rural settlement on the outskirts of Bombay, the kind of place where families knew each other by name, where the pace of life was slow, and where the idea of building a global food empire would have seemed like something out of a fairy tale. This was where the Chauhan family had put down roots. They were not industrialists. They were not merchants with connections to the British trading houses that controlled commerce in colonial Bombay. They were confectioners, makers of traditional Indian sweets, modest, hard-working, deeply rooted in the rhythms of their community. Into this family, in the early years of the 20th century, grew a young man named Mohanlal Dayal Chauhan. The historical record does not give us a dramatic childhood poverty story in the way that Ralph Lauren or Hans Wilsdorf suffered. What it gives us instead is something equally powerful. A man who looked at his country, looked at what was being done to it, and decided he was going to do something about it. Because in 1920s India, the biscuit was a British product, Huntley and Palmer's. Britannia, established in Calcutta in 1892 with British capital. Glucose biscuits, cream crackers, digestives, all of them imported or manufactured by British companies for British tastes, sold at prices that placed them firmly in the hands of the colonial elite and the upper middle-class Indians who had adopted British habits. The ordinary Indian did not eat biscuits. The ordinary Indian could not afford biscuits, and nobody in the food industry seemed to think that was a problem worth solving. Mohanlal Dayal thought differently. In 1929, at a time when India was simmering with the energy of the independence movement, when Gandhi was preparing the Salt March that would shake the foundations of the British Empire, a small group of entrepreneurs in Vile Parle made a decision that would quietly change the food history of an entire civilization. They pooled their resources, they found a rented property in Vile Parle, they installed basic machinery, and they launched a company called Parle Products. The name came from the suburb, simple, local, rooted in the place they came from. There was no global branding consultancy involved, no focus groups, no market research reports, just a family, a rented building, and an absolute conviction that Indians deserved their own products, made on their own soil, sold at prices that real people could afford. The timing was not a coincidence. The Swadeshi movement, the call to buy Indian and boycott British goods, was not just a political slogan. It was an economic earthquake. Indians across the country were making conscious decisions to support homegrown businesses and reject imported products. For a new Indian food company, this was not just a tailwind, it was a founding principle. Parle Products began by making confectionery, sweets, toffees, the kind of products that connected to the family's background. But Mohanlal Dayal and his partners had their eyes on something bigger, something that the British had built into a daily habit for an entire class of consumers. Something that, if they could crack it, could reach not just the upper class but every household in India. Making biscuits in 1929 was not like making them today. There were no automated assembly lines, no computerized mixing systems, no precision temperature-controlled ovens connected to digital dashboards. The early Parle factory was a manual operation. Workers mixed dough by hand. Biscuits were shaped, placed on trays, and baked in ovens that required constant monitoring and adjustment. Quality control was a matter of skill and experience, not technology. Every batch was a small act of craftsmanship. And in those early years, Parle was producing confectionery and slowly, carefully, learning the science of biscuit making. They were studying the British products that dominated the market, understanding what made a good biscuit, what texture, what taste, What shelf life! What a biscuit needed to survive the Indian climate, the heat, the humidity, the long distances between a factory in Bombay and a shop in a small town in Bihar or Rajasthan. Then the world caught fire. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. For India, still under British rule, the consequences were immediate and severe. The British war economy demanded resources. Sugar, which was the primary ingredient in biscuits and confectionery, was rationed. Raw materials became scarce. Import channels for machinery and equipment dried up overnight. Most businesses in Parle's position would have contracted, cut production, and waited for better times. Mohanlal Dayal did not wait. He understood that war created scarcity, and scarcity created opportunity for those who could adapt faster than their competitors. The British brands that dominated the Indian market were large, slow-moving, and dependent on supply chains that the war had disrupted just as badly, if not worse. The agile Indian manufacturer who could source local ingredients, modify recipes to work with what was available, and maintain production when the giants were struggling had a window that might never open again. Parle adapted. They modified their formulations. They worked with local suppliers. They kept the ovens running. And in the middle of all of this, they did something that would change everything. They created the Parle Gluco biscuit. The Gluco biscuit was not a complicated product. That was precisely the point. It was a simple glucose biscuit, rectangular, lightly sweet, slightly crisp, made from wheat flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. The decision to make it affordable was not a marketing strategy. It was a philosophy. Mohanlal Dayal and his partners were not trying to reach the English-educated elite who already bought British biscuits. They were trying to reach the farmer in Punjab, the mill worker in Ahmedabad, the school child in Madras, the railway porter in Howrah, the hundreds of millions of Indians for whom spending money on a branded biscuit had never even been a consideration, because no one had ever made one they could afford. The price point was kept ruthlessly low. The packaging was simple. The distribution strategy was built around reaching the smallest shops in the smallest towns, not just the large department stores and upmarket grocers that the British brands targeted. This was a different kind of ambition. Not the ambition of building a premium product for a narrow market, the ambition of building an essential product for an entire nation. And then, on August 15, 1947, India became free. For Parle products, independence was not just a political event, it was a commercial transformation. The Swadeshi sentiment that had been building for decades was no longer just a movement. It was the operating reality of a new nation. Indian businesses, Indian products, Indian brands, these were no longer just alternatives to British imports. They were expressions of national identity. Parle was perfectly positioned. They were Indian. They were established. They had been making biscuits through the hardest years of the war. They had the factories, the supply chains, the distribution networks, the hard-won knowledge of Indian tastes and Indian logistics. And they had the Gluco biscuit. Parle invested in distribution. They built relationships with distributors and wholesalers across India. They expanded production capacity. They opened new manufacturing facilities. And they refined the Gluco biscuit, improving the recipe, improving the packaging, working relentlessly toward a product that could survive the journey from factory to shop to consumer in perfect condition. But then came a challenge that Parle had not anticipated. Not from British competitors this time, from within their own success. As the Gluco biscuit grew, so did the Imitators. Other Indian manufacturers saw the demand Parle had created and launched their own glucose biscuits with similar names and similar packaging. Gluco biscuits were appearing from multiple manufacturers, and the consumer, especially in smaller towns and rural markets, could not always tell the difference. Parle's carefully built reputation was being diluted by products that traded on the category name they had helped create. In the 1980s, Parle products renamed their flagship biscuit. The Parle Gluco became Parle-G. The G officially stood for glucose, but in the minds of hundreds of millions of Indians, it stood for something much larger. Genius, gold, greatness. It stood for the biscuit you grew up eating, the biscuit your mother packed in your school bag, the biscuit you dunked in your morning chai, the biscuit that was always there, in every home, in every tea stall, in every railway station canteen, in every corner. What they understood, whether by design or by instinct, was that mystery is its own kind of marketing. The girl on the Parle-G wrapper became part of the national conversation in a way that no expensive advertising campaign could have manufactured. She was familiar and unknown at the same time. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Parle-G grew at a pace that was almost difficult to comprehend. India's population was expanding rapidly. Rural incomes were slowly rising. Government programs were putting biscuits, including Parle-G, into school feeding schemes. The biscuit that had been designed as an affordable product for ordinary people was now deeply embedded in national nutrition infrastructure. The 5-rupee pack became iconic. In a country where every paisa mattered, where a family might think carefully before spending money on something that was not an absolute necessity, the Parle-G 5-Rupee pack was something extraordinary. Parle had not just built a successful food brand, they had built something closer to a public utility. A product so affordable and so widely available that it functioned almost like a staple, sitting alongside rice and dal and chai as something that was simply always present in an Indian life. And then, in 1991, India opened its doors to the world. Liberalization changed everything. Foreign companies that had been locked out of the Indian market by decades of protectionist policy were suddenly free to enter, invest, and compete. International food giants, with marketing budgets larger than some Indian states, with global supply chains, with decades of brand-building experience in competitive markets, came flooding in. For Parle, liberalization represented the most serious commercial threat in the company's 60-year history. Britannia, which had always been a competitor, now had access to foreign capital and international partnerships. New international biscuit brands entered the market. Modern retail was beginning to emerge, changing the dynamics of how products reached consumers. Television advertising was exploding, and foreign companies were spending lavishly to introduce their products to Indian consumers who had never seen them before. The pressure on Parle-G's price point was intense. Competitors looked at the 5-Rupee pack and said it was impossible to sustain, that Parle would eventually have to raise prices, compromise on quality, or shrink the pack size to the point where the value proposition collapsed. Parle refused. They invested in manufacturing efficiency. They scaled production to levels that kept unit costs low, even as input prices fluctuated. They protected the 5-Rupee pack with the same ferocity that Mohanlal Dayal had protected his original philosophy. The biscuit was for the common man. It would stay affordable for the common man. Because Parle-G was not just a biscuit, it was a memory. It was the taste of childhood. It was the smell of a grandmother's kitchen. It was the first thing you ate when you were sick and needed something gentle. It was what you shared with a stranger on a long train journey. It was what you gave a child to keep them quiet and happy for 5 minutes. You cannot buy that kind of brand loyalty with a marketing budget. You build it over 60 years by keeping a promise to an entire nation. In 2003, something happened that stopped the global food industry in its tracks. A study by market research firm Nielsen ranked the world's biscuits by volume sold. The results were not what anyone outside India expected. Parle-G was not just the best-selling biscuit in India. It was the best-selling biscuit in the world. 100 billion biscuits a year. Read that number again. 100 billion. If you laid every Parle-G biscuit produced in a single year, end to end, they would circle the earth more than 80 times. The biscuit that was never designed to be glamorous, that never had a celebrity ambassador, that never tried to be sophisticated or trendy or aspirational in the way that modern consumer brands pursue aspiration, had quietly become the most eaten biscuit in human history. Today, Parle Products operates manufacturing plants across India. The company employs tens of thousands of people directly and hundreds of thousands more through its supply chain, distribution network, and retail partners. Parle-G is sold in virtually every retail outlet in India, from gleaming supermarkets in South Mumbai to tiny kirana shops in villages with no paved roads and no reliable electricity. It is part of government nutrition programs. It is distributed in disaster relief operations. During the COVID-19 lockdown of 2020, when India's poorest citizens were most vulnerable, Parle-G sales surged because it was one of the few things both available and affordable enough to serve as emergency nutrition for families who had lost their livelihoods overnight. The biscuit that started in a rented house in Parle became, in the most literal sense, a lifeline. Mohanlal Dayal Chauhan built something that outlasted him in ways that would be almost impossible to overstate. The Chauhan family still controls Parle products. The 5-Rupee pack still exists. The baby girl is still on the wrapper. The biscuit still tastes exactly the way it has always tasted. And every single day, across a country of 1.4 billion people, hundreds of millions of those biscuits are eaten with morning chai, packed into school bags, bought at railway platforms, shared between strangers, given to children, and dunked into cups with the casual, unthinking intimacy of something that has always been there and always will be. That is what Mohanlal Dayal built from a rented house in a quiet Mumbai suburb in 1929. He did not just build a biscuit company, he built something that India runs on. He built Parle-G. And the most remarkable thing about the whole story is this. In a country of a billion stories, in a culture that remembers its movie stars and its cricketers and its politicians with fierce devotion, most people who eat Parle-G every single day of their lives have never once thought about the man who made it possible. That small-town boy from Parle never needed them to. The biscuit did the talking, and the biscuit never stopped.